Welcome everyone to the premiere episode of the channel Old Fart Loves Art, a channel dedicated to Bible-based interpretations of sculpture and pictorial art, and sometimes perhaps a bit of music. I am A.J. Mittendorf, your host on this channel, and I'd like to begin by introducing myself a little bit to you. I was born in South Dakota, United States, and named after my grandfather. He was a German-born immigrant who came to the States in 1901, the year after he was born. His name, therefore mine as well, was Alfred Friedrich Wilhelm Johannes Mittendorf. Now, for the sake of me being an American child in the 1960s, my parents, thankfully, simplified my name a great deal, and I became Alfred Frederick William John Mittendorf. In the days when I started to prepare for going to kindergarten, my parents realized that I was just a little bit too hyperactive to have such a long and complicated name. So they simplified my name to Alfred John Mittendorf. They took my first name and then my third middle name and made those my first and middle name. And then my last name, of course, remained the same. So I became Alfred John Mittendorf. But my grandfather, after whom I was named, insisted that if they're going to reduce my name, for my sake, they should shorten it to how he signed his name on his checks. And so my name ultimately became A.J. Mittendorf. And I stuck with A.J. Mittendorf for the next 40-some years until I moved to Canada, where people would greet me on the street and they'd say, "So, you're up here from the States, eh?" And I'd say, "It's A.J." That's the kind of humor that I go for, and so I hope you enjoyed that introduction to me. I was born in 1962, and I was named after my paternal grandfather, but in all honesty, he insisted before I was ever born that I go by the name AJ. He insisted that because he hated the name Alfred John. As far as I know, he never even used his other middle names, despite the fact that they're on his birth certificate. So, what about the title of this channel? Old Fart Loves Art. What's the meaning behind that title? It's quite simple, actually. I am an old fart, and I love art. I always have. Even so, just because I love art doesn't mean I'm qualified to talk about it, so you may be wondering why you should be interested in listening to me, of all people, talk about art. How do you know that I know what I'm talking about? What are my credentials and qualifications on discussing this topic? Well, the rest of this preliminary episode will be an introduction to this channel, yes, of course, but more importantly, it will be an introduction to me. I'm going to present to you a resume of sorts to show you that I am qualified to discuss art, music, literature, and the Bible in all its glory. Start with my education. Of course, I have graduated from high school. I graduated from Washington High School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 1981. And 2 years later, I joined the Navy for 4 years, and I came back and I went to Morehead State University. It has since changed its name. And I got a degree in English education from Minnesota State University, Morehead in 1992. It came with a music minor. I play double bass, and so my music minor was on the double bass. After that, I got my master's degree in English with emphases on literature and composition from North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. I got that in 1998, and that was after having moved to Canada. So I got it not in distance education for the coursework, but for writing my master's thesis. Yes, definitely distance education. All right, qualifications continued. I am a published writer. I have 8 books, I believe, is the count, on the market. 3 of those books are of poetry. I am primarily a poet, and I do enjoy poetry and writing poems and listening to poems. So my first book of poems is called From Both Sides of Creation. Poems of A.J. Mittendorf, and that was published in 2013. Shortly thereafter, I published another book of poetry called Carnival of the Animals. This is an illustrated volume, but it's not a children's book, not really. Some of the stories that are in there are a little bit over the top for children's stories. So think of it as just an illustrated book of poetry, and the poems are narrative. Poems in this book are, in fact, fables, so they use animal characters to tell a story and teach a lesson. And as such, it is didactic literature, but intentionally so. And finally, my most recent collection of poetry is called Inspired by Music. This volume includes the poems from Carnival of the Animals, but it also has poems that were inspired by Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, by Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, and many others of that nature. And these are all available through Amazon or through your local bookstore or through me if you'd like a signed copy. I have one other book on the market, collection of short biographical true stories that were inspired by a segment on a show called The Vinyl Cafe. The segment was called The Story Exchange. If you're unfamiliar with The Vinyl Cafe, it is a radio show that played in Canada primarily for well over a decade, ending in the host's death in 2017. He died in February of that year. It was a devastation to the entire country, and rightfully so. On this segment called Story Exchange, Stuart McLean invited people to send in short, true stories to him that he would read on the air. And in the years that he did that, it was well over a decade that he did that segment, I was the only writer to have 3 of my stories read on the air by Stuart McLean. 2 of those were published in a collection that he finally did for an anthology in 2013. He and I had talked about me doing what he called a hat trick of hat tricks, so a total of 9 stories for him. Although he did confess that he didn't think he'd be on the air that long. He didn't know how right he was when he said that, but that was a plan that we had. So when Stuart McLean died in 2017, I just kept on writing these stories at the suggestion of my daughter Bella, who thought it might be good therapy for me, and indeed it was. That book will be coming out in a new expanded and revised edition by Christmas time in 2023. I also have a collection of short fiction. This volume includes 13 stories in 3 genres, hence the title, 3 genres. Those genres include Greek myths, science fiction, and horror. And the only reason I include a section called horror is not that I'm writing scary stories or stories about horrible things. I write in order to teach. That's one of the things that I enjoy doing. And these stories all deal with people who are less than perfect, shall we say. And I have it on the authority of a 14-year-old reader that none of them are scary, but all of them are good. One story is about a young woman who dies and gets to the proverbial pearly gates and finds out that she's not going to enter, and the horror that she felt in that case. That type of thing. I have a full-length 3-act play on the market. It is called It Is Well With My Soul, Horatio Spafford's story. And you can tell by the title that it is inspired after the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, which is so famous and so beloved in churches these days. And the play is about the events that inspired that hymn. And then I have also a small book of English-related humor called Auto-Antonyms. It started out to be just a collection of auto-antonyms and another collection of words that are its opposites, but it has evolved into a book related to all kinds of different kinds of words and thoughts on the topic of English. That will be coming out in a new volume around Christmas time or just thereafter as well. And then I'm going to abandon that project because that's in its 5th edition coming up. I have written one novel. It is, at this point, unpublished, however, so I put it on a fan fiction site, and I will leave that link for the first chapter and the prologue in the description below. Now, as far as my professional life goes in the more public vein, I taught English at high school and college levels in the U.S. and in Canada. And for a total of 12 years, I taught at the College of New Caledonia in Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. And so that was the extent of my teaching. I stopped teaching there in 2012 so that I could be closer to my family. And so that was the end of my teaching career. After that, I tutored for a long time, and then COVID came, and since then, nobody wants tutoring anymore, it seems. I also have a music minor, as I told you, and I want you to know some things about that. I played in the South Dakota Symphony in the early 80s under the baton of Emmanuel Vardy, who, among other things, is a world-renowned violist. He lived from 1915 to 2011. Under his baton, I achieved the position of assistant principal on double bass, and I held that position until I joined the Navy in 1983. Since I'm discussing Emmanuel Vardy, though, just in case you don't know his name, he, of course, as I mentioned before, is a world-renowned violist, but he is also the first violist to record all 24 Paganini caprices on viola, which is a fantastic feat. The viola is a very similar instrument, of course, to the violin, but because it's larger, it's more of a challenge to move around the instrument than it is to move around a violin. A man named Dr. Walter May, who is also a violist, wrote 3 viola concerti, 2 of which he wrote for Emmanuel Vardy. So that's quite a feather in his cap, although he really didn't need many feathers in his cap by the time he wrote those concerti. He was the chairman of the music department at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and a very brilliant man in many regards. His wife was my music teacher for many years. I played cello at one point. She was my teacher on that. I tried to play piano. She was my teacher there. And even on double bass for a few years, she taught me on that as well. So she was fairly well-rounded, marvelous cellist herself. So she was my music teacher, but she was also my mother's best friend. My mother died in 1980. At one point, though, when I was still a very young bass player, I think I was around 13, maybe 14, something like that, Mrs. May asked her husband, Dr. May, if he would write a concerto for me. And I suppose I don't have to tell you what an honor that was and still is. So about a year later, I had a one-movement piece called Concertino written for me by Dr. May. The plan for this piece was that I would play it in my high school graduation year with the Sioux Empire Youth Symphony in Sioux Falls. And I did, in fact, play that piece in my graduation year with the Sioux Empire Youth Symphony. The prospect of that thrilled my mother no end, of course, and she figured that since Dr. May wrote 2 concerti for Emmanuel Vardy and 1 for me, that therefore Vardy and I were on a musical par, which is, of course, far from the truth. I am either a very weak professional bass player or a very advanced novice. I'm not sure which is the better description. Sadly, my mother died of cancer when I was 17, the year before my graduation year. She heard me practicing that piece many times at home, and she accompanied me on piano the couple of times that I played it at recitals, but the whole culmination was supposed to be that graduation concert with the Sioux Empire Youth Symphony, and she died before she heard me play there, and that's been a loss for me. In 2013, though, I played that same concerto for Gary Carr at the university in Victoria, UVic, where he taught for a month every year, in July actually, for a camp that he called Carr Camp. I was there in 2013. I played this piece for him, and he thought it was a very good piece. I mean, he loved it. There's no way you can't love the piece, but he recommended that since it was written in such a low register and it was written for me as such a young bass player that I should learn to play the piece up an octave, it does, in fact, sound much better with the accompaniment, especially if it's the accompaniments on piano, when I'm playing it up an octave. So I'm still learning that piece up an octave. It's much more of a challenge, surprisingly, when I play it up that octave. I need to get back to Emanuel Vardi here. That was a little bit of a rabbit, kind of, to chase. As a musical director, Emanuel Vardi was not Zubin Mehta or George Zell, but he was an excellent musical director, a very nice man. And my dear friend John Pesky was one of Emanuel Vardi's prize pupils. And like John, Emanuel Vardi was also an accomplished artist. So I have here 6 of his paintings to show you with relatively little commentary. This first one is called Cello Variations. And I absolutely love that color scheme that he chose for that. This one is called Dvorak American Quartet. Here we have Franck Sonata, F-R-A-N-C-K. Franck Sonata. This piece is called Homage to a Great Violist. There is a caption below this one which says, Homage to a Great Violist, oil on canvas. His painting above was featured on the cover of the Strad magazine when the magazine profiled Emanuel Vardi in 1985. I don't know any of the history of this piece. I just saw it online, and Vardi doesn't do a whole lot of variation with the way he forms a character on the canvas. His variation is much more in how he applies the paint, it appears. So this one is actually very, very clearly a different type of thing. I love the way he portrays the movement in the hands. It really works well. After that, we have On the Roof. And of course, this is a superior piece because it has a double bass in it. No arguments on that. And here we have Violist's Dream, which does remind me, Vardi actually told a joke once. I believe it was during an interview with the local news. He said one time there was a violist who dreamed that he was playing Handel's The Messiah. And when he woke up, he discovered he was. So I don't think that this is the violist's dream that he was talking about in this work of art. But I do remember that story that he told. While I was getting my music minor, I played in the Fargo Moorhead Symphony. For a while I was assistant principal there, but not for very long. I just didn't enjoy playing all that much in that particular symphony at that particular point in my life. But then again, once I moved to Prince George, British Columbia, and got myself established as an English teacher at the college there, I started playing double bass in the local symphony in Prince George, the Prince George Symphony Orchestra. And I started out as being assistant principal because there's only one bass in town, and at the time, that was me. But eventually, I did achieve the official position of principal in the Prince George Symphony Orchestra. And once again, in 2012, I moved south onto Vancouver Island to be closer to family. And since then, I have been doing a whole lot more of the freelancing type of playing. All right, what about my academic and life experience with pictorial art? Let's get into that a little bit here. I don't have a degree in art, but I do have equivalent credits in art history, appreciation, interpretation. I took courses at Moorhead State University, Moorhead, at North Dakota State University, at the University of Northern British Columbia, that's in Prince George, and at the College of New Caledonia, which is also in Prince George, and then finally at the University of Victoria, which is in Victoria, British Columbia. So I have studied art officially in the US and Canada, and when I was in the Navy, I took courses in art then as well. The Navy sent me to Naples, Italy, which, as it turned out, is a very good place to study art. I have no record of the names of the institutions that were in charge of the courses that I took, because they were all field trip type of courses. I never saw a classroom when I studied art there. We just always went to various museums, galleries, and studios, of course, a lot in Florence, a lot in Rome. There were some things in Naples itself, not very interesting, at least not for me at the time. And then I also went to a couple museums in Venice, and there wasn't a lot of variety in topic, but there was a lot of good art there. But if you want to study art, Venice and Rome, you can't top those, especially in the Renaissance and Baroque. So, good times. That's how I spent my off time when I was in the Navy. I grew up loving art. I had art in my home and all around me as I grew up. My grandmother had art hanging in her living room. Her aunt, who would be my great-great-aunt, was Eleanor Douglas. From 1875 to 1914 she lived. And she was called the finest female landscape painter of her day, back in her day. So she was quite famous, quite renowned. And her art dealt mainly with landscapes and trees. In fact, she is known as the painter of trees. My grandmother had 2 of her paintings hanging in her living room. Sadly, it breaks my heart to say this, but I don't have any photographs of those paintings. However, I do have one of Eleanor Douglas's paintings hanging in my living room at this point. It was one that belonged to my mother, and when she died, it came to me. And so I can show you that one, and I can show you some others of her work. Some of these I just experienced. I found them online and downloaded them onto a file. So here are some copies of works by Eleanor Douglas, my great-great-auntie, who is both Canadian and American, like me. So you can see from this first one that she was quite an abstract artist. It was during the post-impressionist era that she was painting. This is called Landscape. And this is one of the ones I just saw recently for the first time and downloaded days ago, actually, from the date of this recording. This one is called Woodland. It's very similar to the one I have hanging in my living room. This one is also called Woodland. This next one is probably the darkest of her paintings that I have ever seen. The canvas itself is no longer on a wooden frame. It's apparently just a loose canvas. And it's very dark. Mind you, Eleanor Douglas did a lot of very dark paintings. This is the darkest I've ever seen of her work, though. But despite it being very dark, it does not seem unhappy. But she was also known for traipsing by herself out into the woods, days on end, carrying all of her painting supplies, canoeing, in fact, to get where she wanted to go to look for a new spot to find subjects for her painting. This one is called Green and Gold, trees. So green and gold with the subtitle of trees. This is called Trees in Spring. Much brighter painting. This one is a little bit more reminiscent of the paintings that were hanging in my grandmother's living room, as far as the brightness and the tone goes. Another painting called Landscape. Here is Forest Pond. This one is called Sunset. I guess it must be a prairie of sorts, a hilly terrain with some trees there on the left in the midground, but the background is hill hiding the setting sun, and the foreground looks like grassy hills as well. And then finally, this is the painting that I own. It is also called Woodland. That seems to be her favorite title. I took this picture myself. You'll have to forgive me. I am not a photographer. And I had to take this picture when I had sunshine shining into my apartment so that I could actually get the sunshine looking on it. Without sunshine, this painting is very dark as well. Not as dark as that one, but boy, I tell you, she had some dark, dark paintings. But again, never unhappy. This one is very dark without the sunlight. But you can tell by looking at it here that it's not a painting that shows unhappiness in any stretch of the imagination. So that is the art of Eleanor Douglas that I know of at this point. In addition to loving art at home, I also have 20 or more articles published on an online magazine called Artists' Artworks. One of those articles is actually about my Aunt Eleanor, and the link for that is in the description. I learned recently that she also had a studio in New York City on Douglas Street, number 48 Douglas Lane. Pardon me, not street, Douglas Lane. And Douglas Lane, the name has only a single S, but my Auntie Eleanor's last name was Douglas with two S's, something that my grandmother was very proud of. It's Douglas with two S's, she would tell me. But Auntie Eleanor dropped one of the S's from her last name during her professional life. It's my conjecture that she did so to eliminate the confusion between Douglas Lane, where her studio was, and her name, so that people would be able to keep those things straight. That's a guess. I really have no idea. I do know that my grandmother told me more than once that the family was very upset with Auntie Eleanor for dropping the second S from the name Douglas. In addition to Auntie Eleanor, however, I'm also related by marriage to the famous painter Grant Wood, who's famous for painting the American Gothic, among other things. The man who was the model for the man in the painting was my grandmother's dentist. As it turns out, he was also Grant Wood's dentist. So it was a small community in Iowa. And my grandmother's older sister, Miriam, married that dentist's son. So that was Byron Jr. And this would have been my Auntie Miriam. I never met Miriam either. So by marriage, that makes me at least distantly, I suppose, related to Grant Wood. I remember also we had a clock in Grandma's house that belonged to Dr. McKeeby, again, the dentist in the American Gothic. And that old clock, I tell you, had the most resonant clicks of time that I've ever heard. You'd wake up early in the morning and you'd sit in the sunshine pouring in through the windows of the living room, and that the only sound in the living room would be that clock ticking away, and it was beautiful. My mother also had a high-quality print of Grant Wood's painting called Stone City. I always loved this image as a child. The hill that you see just to the right of center and a little bit above it, I used to imagine that hill was the head of some sort of sleeping giant with his nose stuffed into a pile of peas. You heard right. A sleeping giant with his nose stuffed in peas. That's how I imagined that. As I was very young at the time, please understand. The shadow of that poplar tree served as his closed eye, and the road to the left of the hill I imagined being his shirt collar or maybe his pajama collar. I'm not sure which. But that's how I interpreted that painting when I was 5 or 6 years old. That print, however, is now in my possession, hanging in my apartment. So that's pretty much my experience with art. Some 20 articles on artists' artwork, plus the one about my auntie, all of them that I wrote. That's my professional experience in art so far. Some of those articles were educational. Some of them were promotional, to talk about certain artists in order to encourage readers to buy art. There were also some articles that were somewhat analytical, but all of them were there to help promote art and the appreciation of art. This channel is dedicated to Bible-based interpretations of art. What right do I have to talk about that? Where are my credentials for that? Obviously, I don't have a degree in theology. I would have mentioned that if I did. However, you should know I am a born-again, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, God-fearing Christian. I intend to die that way. I've been a Christian since 1983, and I have been studying and teaching the Bible for those 40 years. Exactly 40 years as of this year. This is June of 2023 that I'm recording this. So that's been 40 years of me studying the Bible, and I have taught Sunday school to adults in church. I have led Bible studies in my home. I have done guest speaking in church on more than one occasion. And I also do a monthly Bible presentation on tithes and offerings, where I talk about a Bible verse and use that to encourage parishioners to keep their giving grounded in scriptures. I'm not trying to motivate people by, guilting them into giving, but by making sure that when they give, they do so for Bible-based reasons. And so I do that on a monthly basis. So I have 40 years of knowledge with the Bible and studying and learning it, and that's basically my foundation. I use that, combine it with art, and I come up with this channel. So here is an introduction to this channel. What about it? All right. So, as I said already, it's dedicated to Bible-based interpretation of art, mostly pictorial and sculpture, but not entirely. Literary interpretations are going to be left to my other channel called Poetry Revival. But here we will look at art that expresses Christian or biblical ideas, even if they may be somewhat erroneous. For example, some things that Michelangelo expressed in his art are not Bible-based truths, but we can look at the painting anyway through a Bible perspective and talk about where Michelangelo has things right. We'll also examine other types of secular art looking for Christian or biblical themes, and still, some other times, we will just be looking at art for the sake of having fun and taking pleasure in the appreciation of pictorial art, and that's what art is all about anyway. Let's face it, nobody is going to starve for not appreciating art, except maybe the artist. That's always been true, I suppose. The first official video on art on this channel, which will be the next episode, will be an examination of Leonardo da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper. And that will be a two-part video. In the first part, I'm going to give a mere formal visual analysis, just looking at composition, space, form, color, line, tone, those kinds of things. But I will not be looking at interpretation, symbolism, or meaning until I get to the second part of that episode, which will be episode 3. Before I sign off, I'd like you to know that I am doing 3 other channels. Other than this channel, Old Fart Heart Art, I also do Poetry Revival, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. I do another one called Conan the Grammarian, in which I talk humorously about English-related topics. And then I have a final one called Theolaman, but it's pronounced Theolaman. And it's Bible-based topics that I look at as a layman, and that's what happens in that channel. So, Once you're done here, go ahead and look at my other channels and make sure you subscribe to them all. I do have a business that encompasses all 4 of these channels. It's called Solo Deo Gloria, which is how both Bach and George Frederick Handel signed their pieces of work once they were finished. They would write at the bottom SDG. In Handel's case, in Bach's case, he actually wrote out the entire phrase in order to give God glory for the work that these men had accomplished. Because without God, their work would have meant nothing, and they knew that. And so in the same vein, these 4 channels that I have are dedicated to the work of God in my life, and hopefully they can be blessings for you as well. Thank you very much for watching. I ask you humbly to please like this video. Click that like button. If you just think, gee, I like that video, but you don't click that like button, then I have no idea that you like the video. That's the only way I will really know, is if you click that button. I also ask that you like the Facebook pages regarding this channel, Facebook and MeWe, soon to come. Please subscribe. That helps me out a great deal. And don't forget to click that bell icon so that you get notifications every time I upload a new episode. Feel free to leave positive comments, respectful comments below. I will do my best to read them as promptly as I can. And finally, I request that you share this video. Share it with people who you just know, whether they are art lovers or not, but also please share it with art lovers. I want you all to have a great day, great couple of weeks, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.